On April 30th of 1930, a woman from a village near the South Korean city of Yeongcheon wandered up into the nearby hills to gather wild herbs and vegetables. Yet as she walked among the lush rolling hills, pulling up wild green onions and bulbs of wild garlic, she came across something as unexpected as it was horrifying. Lying in the dirt was the lifeless body of a teenage boy, one who had been beaten so badly that he was barely recognizable. At the time, Korea was under the occupation of the Imperial Japanese military, and given that they were the region's only authority, it fell to them to investigate the murder. Not far from the boy's body, the Japanese Kempei-tai officers discovered a small towel, along with the wooden skeleton of an old-fashioned carry frame. When the cause of death was discovered to be suffocation, the officers' first theory was that the towel had been the murder weapon. During the 48 hours that followed, the officers canvassed local villagers, asking them if they knew of anyone who'd gone missing recently. One villager told them of a young man named Chang Soo, who'd vanished about a week before and whose description matched the age, height, and weight of the deceased. The Japanese officers then discovered that Park had been employed as a general assistant at a local inn and promptly went to question the owners. None of the inn staff admitted any knowledge of Park's disappearance, yet conversations with its customers revealed a very different story. On the morning of April 26th, just 3 days before Park's body was found, a customer had spotted Chang Soo being beaten by his employer and a fellow coworker. These men, Ko Ok-dan and Cho Kai-jun, were apparently using short sticks to violently attack the young Chang Soo, who was trying and failing to both flee and defend himself. Acting on this newfound knowledge, the Japanese officers moved to apprehend both men, and just 2 days later, Ko Ok-dan admitted to murdering Chang Soo, with the officers recording the following admission. The innkeeper Ko was the second wife of a rich man named Han Bak-wan, who lived a village over. As Han's first wife was jealous and did not want Ko under the same roof, Ko was given allowance to set up an inn in Yeongcheon. Ko was in her early 20s at the time, and supposedly she was popular with the men. When a man named Lee Ki-moon asked her to run away with him instead of declining him, she asked him for time to think. For whatever reason, Park told Han, and Han reprimanded Ko. Furious, Ko conspired to kill Park. With Cho, they took Park to the mountains at night, beat him, and strangled him with the towel. At face value, it seems like an open and shut case, yet we have to keep in mind that the Japanese military police may well have employed some very unsavory methods to obtain their confession. The Japanese occupation of the 1930s and 40s were a brutal and bloody era for those who suffered under them, and although atrocities in China gained most of the spotlight, life for Koreans was just as harsh. It'd be pure speculation on my part to say the Japanese officers tortured Ko Ok-dan, but the fact that he later tried to recant his confession provides a compelling argument. Yet regardless of his guilt or innocence, Park's co-worker and employer were sentenced to 10 and 15 years respectively, doomed to serve out their time in some of the most horrific prison camps in modern history. Meanwhile, Chang Soo's mother had apparently confirmed that the dead body was that of her son, and Japanese police had transferred possession of the corpse to his family. Park's parents grieved, and at his funeral, his siblings helped lower his corpse into his grave before saying a final, teary goodbye. Almost 6 months went by, and although the pain had faded, the shadow of grief still lingered for the Park family. Then, on the morning of October 18th, Park's mother was in the middle of some housework when she heard a knock at the door. She hadn't been expecting anyone, so it was with a degree of puzzlement that she walked to the door and opened it. Yet when she saw who it was, standing there on the doorstep, she let out an ear-splitting scream. It was her dead son, Chang Soo. He had returned. At first, Park's mother was so convinced of her son's death she believed the apparition of her son was nothing more than a spirit. But it was no ghost, no mere specter. Park Chang Soo was actually alive. And while his story wasn't particularly remarkable, the vacuum of information caused by his absence has caused a frighteningly bizarre series of events. Obviously, the beating that Ko and Cho had given him that morning hadn't actually killed him, yet Park claimed that he was so ashamed of the incident that he'd simply packed up and moved to another village for 3 months. There, he'd found employment as a laborer building new homes and had returned to his village with a handsome amount of pay. It was fantastic news for the Park family, and they were far too pleased to see him to be mad about him disappearing. But a very big question remained. If Park Chang Soo was alive, who was buried in the grave bearing his name? The revelation caused something of a local scandal, and the Japanese knew that they'd have to act if they were to maintain public order. Eventually, the Japanese military police essentially blamed Park's mother, insisting her false identification was to blame. On the other hand, Park's mother had been adamant that the dead body had belonged to her son, yet it is unlikely to have sought a confrontation with the military occupiers given the risks associated with such defense. Yet for the sake of argument, is it possible that Park's mother could have failed to recognize him? Well, by the time the body that was believed to be Park Chang Soo was returned to his village, it had been almost a week after the death. A lack of refrigeration would have compromised the integrity of the corpse, and that's not even counting the fact that the victim's face had been beaten to a bloody pulp. Then there's the fact that the clothes the victim had been wearing were handed over to the Park family. Sure, they could have been similar to items owned by Chang Soo, but the fact remains, they weren't his clothes. Why the family didn't realize this is another question entirely, but this is just one unanswered question among dozens of more pertinent ones. What's worse, these clothes were then disposed of, meaning that the one real clue to the body's true identity had been lost forever. Ko and Cho, Chang Soo's former colleagues, were eventually released following an appeal. Once again, both men insisted that they had been forced to confess under duress and that they were innocent of the crime. But unlike many murder investigations, the identity of the true killer was not the only mystery. The identity of the victim also remained unknown. Once again, an urgent general appeal was disseminated by the Japanese military, urging anyone with missing teenage relatives to come forward. Yet no one did. The Japanese were met with eerie silence from the surrounding population. Someone knew something, but for some reason, they just weren't willing to come forward. It was then speculated that the boy was an orphan, and that someone, perhaps his only legal guardian, had been his killer. A variety of orphanages were contacted in the hopes that they might be able to shed some light on the situation. Yet when it came to narrowing down suspects, the only thing investigators discovered was that they'd be better off looking for a needle in a haystack. During the opening phases of the Sino-Japanese War, official bookkeeping of any kind was lackluster to say the least, and it soon became painfully obvious that the Japanese officers were basically looking for a ghost. The victim might have had no family to speak of, no guardian to account for him. He might not have even had a name to begin with. The most likely explanation for this case seems to be that, in her grief, Park Chang Soo's mother simply misidentified an extremely mutilated body. If neither boy had any distinguishing marks and were of similar height and build, it's not out of the question that a misidentification occurred, especially if she was being pushed to do so by a tyrannical occupier who simply wished to wash their hands of the whole sordid incident. But then again, how often does a mother not recognize her child? Some say mother and child have an almost preternatural connection, one that often defies conventional wisdom or commonly accepted science. What if the dead body she saw that day was her son, just another version of him? Like a shadow, an echo or reflection in the very fabric of time and space. Granted, this is starting to sound like an episode of The Twilight Zone, so I'll refrain from going down such a spurious rabbit hole. But the fact that a mother apparently failed to recognize her own son, that just doesn't sit right with me. and I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised to hear that something about this particular unsolved mystery isn't quite as it seems. At around 7 p.m. on February 4th, 1997, Arizona police officers discovered an abandoned blue two-door Honda Accord near East Monroe Street in the state capital of Phoenix. The interior was nothing short of a horror movie. Lying in one of the seats was the dead body of an African-American woman. Most of her teeth were missing, and she had extensive burns all over her body. The damage was so catastrophic that at first, police believed her to be anything between 20 and 50 years of age. The car wasn't registered in her name, nor was it registered in the state of Arizona, and according to witnesses, the woman was a known transient who was sleeping in the car at the time of the fire. Naturally, the cause of death was assumed to be smoke inhalation, but the questions over the fire's origins persisted. Was it simply a horrible accident, perhaps after falling asleep with a lit cigarette? Or was there a more sinister explanation for the blaze? The latter seemed to be confirmed when an empty brown vinyl purse was found near the car. On it, written in dark blue ink, was the following message that read exactly as follows. Monique hates Allende's spirits from out of hell. Monique hates all Satan, God, males, children's, and shall soon be Alal and evil. What exactly the author meant by such a fractured and cryptic message is a complete mystery, but it seemed investigators had a name for their victim, Monique. Police hoped to find a friend or relative of Monique's, but an appeal for information went unanswered. The only witnesses who seemed to know of her did so in passing, adding that she'd simply showed up sometime prior while living in her car. She didn't seem to be involved in any illegal activity, nor had she aggravated any of the area's residents since commencing her stay. Monique's fingertips were too badly burned to be used for identification, and DNA taken didn't match any in the national database. Another possible ID technique would be dental records, but this brings us back to the fact that she was missing her teeth. We can understand how her fingertips might be distorted as the result of burns, and a heavy methamphetamine addiction might account for missing teeth. But every single tooth? It might sound cynical of me, but I think there's a strong possibility that Monique's death was a professional job. A vehicle fire with all that gas, plastic, and rubber raising the core temperature of the flames, making an adequate ad hoc crematorium. And without the victim's teeth, identifying them is no small task. It might have been crude, but no one can deny the car fire's effectiveness. Despite an extensive investigation, Arizona authorities had no idea who the woman was, and the decision to bury her as a Jane Doe was definitely not taken lightly. If it was someone's intention to mask the woman's identity, they definitely achieved their goal. And then there's the little detail of Monique's DNA not being in the national database. This could only realistically be the case if she'd never been in trouble with the law. Even some of those arrested for crimes that are eventually released over have DNA samples taken, so this leads me to believe that Monique lived well within the law. Some have suggested that Monique had some kind of mental breakdown, and that the message scrawled on her purse was a kind of note left by her, almost implying that she had done this to herself. But unless this mental breakdown involved removing every single one of her own teeth, the most likely explanation again leans towards some kind of concerted attempt to conceal her identity post-mortem. But who could Monique have angered so much that they'd wish to dispose of her in such a clinical and sinister method? That little point might well remain a mystery. With no forensic evidence recovered, there's very little chance of her killer or their motivations ever being discovered. Although Monique's identity remains an unsolved mystery, her DNA was entered into CODIS database. That means that it's very possible that her identity might be discovered in the future, but as experts are saddened to admit, the chances of that happening are very slim indeed. We can only hope that, by some bizarre twist of fate, Monique might finally see some semblance of justice. On March 11th of 1877, Alfred Léonard Loewenstein was born into a wealthy German baking family in the Belgian capital of Brussels. By his late 30s, Alfred was himself a successful investment banker, so much so that at the outbreak of the First World War, he was able to offer the Belgian government $50 million in financial aid after the country's occupation by the neighboring Kaiserreich. Alfred's wealth was mostly derived from the early 20th century's budding electrical power industry, but he'd also made considerable gains in the artificial silk business. By the early 1920s, Alfred was worth the equivalent of almost $750 million, which made him the third wealthiest person on the planet. He was so well respected as a financier that his advice was often sought by monarchs and ministers from all over the world, and the British government even made him a companion of the Most Honorable Order of the Bath. Yet despite his immense wealth, Alfred would gain infamy for an entirely different reason, and that particular story begins on the evening of July 4th, 1928, when he stepped onto an airplane over in London, England. Alfred was scheduled to fly from Croydon Airport to Brussels on his very own private plane, and just before 7 p.m., he and 6 others, including the pilot, took off into the skies above Britain. As the plane was crossing the English Channel, Alfred is said to have walked to the rear of the aircraft in order to use the bathroom. But after some time had passed and Alfred had yet to reappear, one of his companions went to check on him. It's important to keep in mind that the plane's main cabin was separated from its bathroom by a rather heavy door. So when Alfred's companion went looking for him and opened this particular door, they not only found the bathroom empty, but they found the plane's rear exit hatch wide open. This was in the 1920s, and back then, civilian aircraft didn't fly nearly as high as they do today. And therefore, this hatch could have been opened at will without anyone picking up on a major change in cabin pressure. To all involved, it seemed as if Alfred had simply excused himself before walking out the rear hatch and throwing himself to his death in the frothing waters below. When rumors of Alfred's death reached London, corporations began panic selling publicly traded shares, and it caused a sharp decrease in their overall value. Alfred's body was discovered near Bologna not long after, and was taken by a fishing boat to Calais, where his identity was confirmed by means of his wristwatch. At the request of his family, an autopsy was performed, but his brother-in-law made it clear that they did not suspect anyone of foul play. This autopsy revealed a partial fracture of Loewenstein's skull and several broken bones, and it was concluded that he had been alive when he struck the water. He was then buried in a cemetery outside Yverdon, in a tomb belonging to his wife's family, the Misons. However, in a rather sinister development, his name was never carved on the slab covering his casket, so in effect, Alfred was buried in an unmarked grave, with no record of his death being kept outside of dusty ministerial filing cabinets. Then, around a week later, the Accidents Branch of the British Air Ministry concluded that it would have been impossible for someone to accidentally open the door and fall out. One of the ministry's employees had thrown himself against the aircraft's entry door, which had opened around 6 inches. However, he was immediately thrown back into the aircraft when the slipstream violently slammed the door shut, proving an accident was impossible. If Alfred Loewenstein had fallen out of the aircraft, it was definitely a deliberate attempt to take his own life. Or was it? Over the years that followed Alfred's death, there had been many alternative theories put forward which attempted to explain what really happened that evening. The New York Times purported that, on the basis of comments made by acquaintances shortly before his disappearance, Alfred had been suffering from a kind of rapid mental decline. To them, It seemed entirely plausible that Alfred had absent-mindedly opened the wrong door, then stepped out into the open air, 1,000 feet above the English Channel, believing it was the bathroom. Some have theorized that Alfred's businesses were on the verge of collapse and that his latest venture, International Holdings and Investments Limited, was little more than a cover for his attempt to save his dying empire. But others have suggested that the skull fracture present on the corpse was the result of foul play, with someone subduing Alfred before throwing him from the aircraft. One of the advocates for such a theory is William Norris, who wrote the 1987 book The Man Who Fell from the Sky, which is essentially a thesis describing a conspiracy within the Loewenstein family. Norris suggested that Alfred had actually been thrown from the aircraft by his own pilot, Donald Drew, at the behest of his estranged wife, Madeline Loewenstein. We can quite easily speculate that this was nothing more than an attempt to gain control of the Loewenstein's family fortune, but it wouldn't shock me if there was more insidious motives at play. Other more outlandish theories are floating around, some of which involve Alfred being dispatched by a hitman hired by infamous American mobster Arnold Rothstein, after the former decided to dip his toe into the illegal opium market. But William Morris was quick to note that Alfred's son, Robert, would later shoot one of the family's servants, claiming that there had been an attempt on his life. He would also go on to die in an aviation accident in 1941 while serving in the Air Transport Auxiliary. Naturally, many have claimed that this was no accident, and mark a concerted effort to eliminate the Loewenstein bloodline. But crime writers Robert and Carol Bridgestock have speculated that Alfred faked his own death in order to escape the fallout of his failing businesses. And considering the unmarked grave and the absence of Alfred's wife at his funeral, there seems to be a surprising amount of weight to such a theory. The idea that the world's third richest man might procure a dead body, one similar in appearance to himself, in order to use it in a scheme motivated by greed, is not entirely the stuff of science fiction, is it? After almost a week of being tossed around the waters of the English Channel, identifying the body mightn't prove the easiest of tasks. We can speculate all we like regarding the grim nature of Alfred's fate, but at the end of the day, it remains an unsolved mystery. Any kind of formal investigation into the incident was eschewed by the family, and jurisdictional squabbles between the British and French governments resulted in a complete lack of formal prosecution. So, accident or not, we may never find out who killed Alfred Loewenstein, or who had the definitive reason for wanting him dead. And in a bizarre twist of fate, it may have been Alfred's own wealth that was used to sweep the trail clear of his killer's tracks. Hailing from Surrey, in Canada's British Columbia, 31-year-old Blair Adams was employed as a foreman at a local construction company. All that knew him said that he was a cheerful, friendly, and fun-loving individual who was easy to talk to and easy to work with. But that only made the sudden change in his demeanor all the more noticeable and all the more frightening, because during the summer of 1996, almost everyone in his life noticed that Blair's behavior had taken a distinct turn for the worse. According to Blair's mother, the young man began exhibiting violent mood swings and suddenly seemed considerably more irritable and volatile during innocuous everyday situations. Something was obviously the matter, Sandra Adams later said. He hadn't been sleeping well. I asked him numerous times what was wrong, and he said, "I don't think I should tell you about it." To this day, I don't know what it was. Blair's unusual behavior steadily mounted until Friday, July 5th of 1996, when things seemed to reach a severely concerning peak. Blair drove down to the local bank and withdrew his every penny of his savings from his account. He also emptied the family's safety deposit box of more than 10,000 Canadian dollars in cash and jewelry before completely disappearing. Blair's family correctly assumed that he was planning on absconding with the money, but to where and to what end, they could only speculate. 2 days after his initial disappearance, Blair mysteriously appeared at the U.S. border, carrying nothing but a change of clothes and his bag full of valuables. Blair might have expected an easy crossing, as he had no formal criminal record at the time, yet he was shocked to find that he was denied entry by immigration officials. To them, it didn't matter if he had no history of criminality, because Blair fit the profile of a narcotics trafficker. He was young, single, unemployed male, carrying nothing but a change of clothes and almost 20,000 Canadian dollars in cash and valuables. And most importantly, the story was just not adding up. After being denied entry to the United States, Blair spent $1,600 on a round trip to Frankfurt in Germany, which was apparently the home of his long-distance girlfriend. They had met the year before when Blair had traveled to Germany to work for his stepfather's construction company, and had been pining for each other ever since. She had not expected his visit, as for some reason Blair hadn't informed her of his trip, but nevertheless, she was pleased to hear that he was coming to visit, and invited him to stay at her place. She would later state that she knew Blair to be gentle and kind with her, but was aware of a much darker, much more confrontational side to him too, one he seemed to display with his work colleagues. Back in Canada, Blair's mother, Sandra, had already reported her son missing, but found proving information was painfully difficult. As we've already heard, Blair's behavior had become increasingly erratic and paranoid, and this involved alienating and isolating his mother. He would evade questions, withhold information, or would simply refuse to discuss certain aspects of his life with her. She obviously had his cell phone number, but on the few occasions he did answer her calls in the time after his disappearance, he refused to tell her where he was going. Yet Blair's mother was quick to point out that her son wasn't angry or abusive when talking to her. He sounded scared. This seemed to be corroborated when police contacted a friend of Blair's, the last person he spoke to in Canada before fleeing. This friend earnestly revealed that just before his departure, Blair had arrived at her apartment unannounced before tearfully revealing that someone was trying to kill him. The friend asked who his would-be assassin was, and at first, Blair refused to say, but later admitted to being terrified of a group of former coworkers he'd met in Germany. He also mentioned several times that he wished to move to the U.S. state of Tennessee, although he refrained from specifying why he'd had his sights set on the volunteer state. His obsession with Tennessee must have been what eventually motivated him to abandon his trip to Germany, as on the same day he was due to fly out, Blair once again attempted to enter the United States. Only this time, he was successful. He crossed over the border into Washington state, traveling directly to SeaTac International Airport, where he promptly bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. It should be noted that Blair was offered a cheaper return ticket for almost half the price, yet he insisted on spending more on a one-way. I think this is a testament to how irrational Blair was acting at the time. He didn't have to take the return flight, so why waste the extra money? On the other hand, this might be a sign that he actually wanted people to know where he was going, as well as his intentions once he'd arrived at his intended destination. A return ticket might suggest he intended to return at some point. A single would mean a solid trail to DC. That being said, it might have just been a performative gesture, one that screamed, "I'm not coming back." In any case, Blair arrived at Washington Dulles Airport early Wednesday morning. He then rented a Toyota from an airport rent-a-car desk before traveling more than 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. The first witness sightings of Blair were at a Knoxville gas station at around 5:30 in the afternoon. Blair was apparently complaining to the gas station attendant that his car wouldn't start, and the attendant apparently responded by telling Blair he had the wrong car keys. Witnesses say this attendant helped Blair both out of the premises and his car, but the keys were nowhere to be found. This is around the same time that the attendant jokingly asked Blair if the keys had been in his pocket the whole time. It was meant to be nothing but a quip, a throwaway comment to lighten Blair's overly serious demeanor, but Blair reacted extremely oddly to it. The attendant later said that Blair almost violently denied he was in possession of the keys. But instead of getting the impression that Blair's intelligence had been insulted, the attendant stated that it seemed as if Blair was lying. Blair was lying. He certainly committed to the act, as he later hitched a ride to a nearby motel where his evening took a dramatic and horrifying turn. Tyka Hartsfield, an employee of the motel, remembered Blair well. He seemed real paranoid, she later said, almost like he was expecting someone to come in on him even though there wasn't anybody there. I don't know who, but he was waiting for somebody to walk in for him. Tyka said Blair's behavior was merely skittish at first, but it didn't take long before he appeared very fearful indeed. In the space of just an hour, the motel's security cameras recorded Blair going in and out of the lobby 5 times before he finally paid for a room. After receiving his room key, the lobby's camera recorded Blair sliding into his pocket, but instead of walking to his room, Blair walked right back out through the main entrance, never to return. His exit was at exactly 7:37 p.m., marking one of the last times Blair would be seen alive. The only other person to see him would be the person that killed him. Just over 20 hours after Blair walked out of the hotel lobby, his lifeless body was discovered in a parking lot about half a mile from the motel. He was nude from the waist down, his shoes had been taken off, and his socks were turned inside out. Someone had apparently torn Blair's shirt open before scattering almost $4,000 in American, Canadian, and German currency all around his corpse. There was also a small sack that contained Blair's other valuables, gold and jewelry estimated to be worth $2,000 total. The Toyota car keys that Blair claimed to have been missing were also discovered, just 10 feet away from his body, proving he might well have been lying back at the gas station. Yet the fact that he had another set of car keys on his body from an entirely different rental company and car gives weight to the theory that he really did think he'd lost the keys. According to Blair's autopsy report, he sustained a plethora of cuts, bruises, and abrasions. But the ultimate cause of death was determined to be a powerful blow to his abdomen, which ruptured his stomach and caused serious internal bleeding. Law enforcement stated that the murder weapon was most likely to have been a club or crowbar, and that the defensive wounds on Blair's hands and forearms showed he'd attempted to defend himself from his killer. Yet the biggest clue was something Blair held in his hand. Clenched in his cold, dead fist was a long strand of someone's hair. This would prove the only forensic evidence found at the scene, a memento from the last person to see him alive. Although there is a history of mental illness in Blair's family, Blair himself had never been officially diagnosed with a condition of any kind, and despite Blair struggling with substance abuse and addiction in the past, his family and friends claimed that he had been sober for 2 years prior to his death, and this was supported by the fact that there were no traces of narcotics in his bloodstream. The only person who reported any suspicious activity prior to Blair's death was a security guard from a nearby business, who claimed that he had heard a sudden female scream at around 3:30 a.m. The next thing we know, Blair's lying dead in a parking lot. Blair's family were completely bemused at his obsession with fleeing to Tennessee. Germany, sure, he had a romantic interest there, but Tennessee? Blair had never been there before in his life. He didn't know a soul there, and he certainly had no interest in country music. So why Tennessee of all places? There were some who believed that Blair's life was genuinely in danger and that, true or not, his life could be saved by someone or something down in Knoxville. However, whatever forces were hunting him down caught up with him, killed him, and then here we are. Yet perhaps an even more harrowing theory is that Blair had suffered from a complete and utter mental break. He could have been paranoid to the point of delusion, resulting in him attacking the person whose hair he clung to in death. Then either the hair's owner or a loved one could have attacked Blair, hit him a little too hard, then bingo, he receives the wound that kills him. This is definitely the more logical of the two theories, and while I'm not ruling out a straight-up murderous conspiracy here, I think we can all agree that an awful lot of Blair's behavior suggests some kind of degenerative brain disorder. Either he was so scared that he was making simple mistakes, such as losing his car keys or spending money he didn't need to, or Blair had completely lost all reason and logic thanks to some kind of chemical imbalance in his brain. Theories aside, what we know for certain is that 22 years later, Blair Adams' death remains an unsolved mystery. No one knows why he was in Tennessee. No one knows why he was acting so strangely, and most importantly, no one knows who killed him. It may be the case that the truth surrounding his death is as depressing as it is mundane, just another young man with mental health problems that were diagnosed too late. But maybe something much deeper and much darker is going on here. Maybe Blair found something he shouldn't have. Maybe Blair knew something so awful or sickening and it could have ruined someone's life. Someone rich, someone powerful, someone with a lot to lose. Someone who felt their life was threatened enough to have Blair's taken away entirely. In 2019, 64-year-old retired industrial mechanic Roger Ellis was enjoying a well-deserved rest in the East Canadian town of Bathurst, New Brunswick. Roger busied himself with home improvements and helped shoulder the child-rearing duties of his own grown-up children who had young families of their own. He also seemed a picture of health and made a point of eating healthy and keeping himself fit. Yet one day, Roger suddenly collapses while complaining of chest pains. Fearing he was in the midst of a heart attack, his family rushed him to hospital and were naturally relieved to discover that what had occurred was no heart attack. But just days later, after being released from the hospital, Roger began suffering from violent seizures. During the weeks that followed, Roger seemed to become steadily more anxious and disoriented, often forgetting what he was doing or repeating things he'd already said. To his family's enduring horror, his health began to rapidly decline, and his next stay in the hospital would last an agonizing 3 months. Roger was confined to a wheelchair for most of this time, and due to having to be fed through a feeding tube, he lost 60 pounds in weight over the course of his stay. He was on death's door on a number of separate occasions, and although doctors were proficient enough to prevent his death, they were completely at a loss as to the cause of his condition. Epilepsy was quickly ruled out, and it became evident a stroke wasn't to blame. Roger was negative for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, devoid of autoimmune disorders, and a full-body scan revealed he was completely free of any cancers. This initial 3-month stay snowballed into 6 months, then 6 months became a year. After that, Roger was transferred to a permanent care home capable of providing the specialist care he required. To this day, Roger Ellis remains in that very same care home, but his loved ones believe his case is somehow connected to a series of other incidents in which seemingly healthy people suddenly began suffering from a mysterious, progressive neurological illness. These cases are mostly confined to a sparsely populated region of New Brunswick, and have doctors completely and utterly mystified. As you can imagine, such a phenomenon had triggered intense debate among the scientific community, with points of contention centering around artificial versus natural causes. Dr. Alir Marrero, the neurologist who first identified the affliction, stated that victims experience unexplained pains, spasms, and disturbing behavioral changes. These symptoms would dissipate for a small percentage of sufferers, but the majority would later suffer frightening weight loss and cognitive decline. Patients were said to drool as their teeth chattered, with some even experiencing terrifying hallucinations. A total of 48 cases have been officially confirmed, but after tracking these cases for more than a year, researchers speculate the total number of infected could be well in the hundreds by the end of 2021. For years, no clear solution lay in sight, and the breakout of the recent pandemic stifled what little progress had been made. Recently, the health minister of New Brunswick announced that no significant evidence that any known food, behavior, or environmental exposure could be responsible. which in layman's terms, this simply means they still have no idea what's causing the bizarre and terrifying infections. They just know what's not causing it. On top of that, some have called the announcement's source material into question. The document presented to the Canadian Association of Neuropathologists claims the 8 deaths attributed to the cluster were misdiagnoses of known diseases such as Alzheimer's and cancer, whereas scores of physicians and researchers from all over eastern Canada have asserted that no such misdiagnoses took place, and the infections they dealt with were unique variants of some new and terrifying ailment. Such criticism has caused a great deal of concern among the loved ones of those affected. To some of them, it seems like local officials are happy to just move on without a proper investigation, almost like they've got something to hide. On the other hand, Roger Ellis's son, Steve, is less conspiratorially minded. It was just a display of how incompetent and disorganized the province had been, he said, adding that other families he'd spoken to were devastated by the government's response. As we've already mentioned, the pandemic definitely threw a biological spanner into the works of the investigation, but the reaction of provincial authorities ranges from woeful to suspiciously inept. For some reason, the government of New Brunswick turned down aid from the Canadian federal government. Then, when the feds attempted to assist the thinly stretched medical teams, officials forbid them access to the tissue samples taken from deceased patients. It was unbelievable, one whistleblower later said. Even a layperson understands that you're never going to find anything by just looking at the phenomenon itself. You need to have a control group. It was just rookie epidemiology. Public knowledge of the phenomenon began in mid-2020, but only after a government memo was leaked to the press. Written and disseminated by the New Brunswick Public Health Agency, the memo implored physicians to be on the lookout for a disease with symptoms similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a rare fatal brain disease caused by malformed proteins known as prions. So, the fact that the local government was soon championing another study, one which suggested that 8 of the victims had died from unrelated brain diseases, was very suspicious indeed. We've asked unequivocally for that study to be pulled and for an apology to be issued, said the head of the nonprofit advocacy group Bloodwatch. Every single scientist that our organization has ever worked with or reached out to is absolutely mortified. The report was also condemned by Canada's Public Health Agency, which accused its author of improperly using private data. Over the past few months, experts have said it's increasingly likely that a neurotoxin found in blue-green algae blooms could help explain the varied symptoms. One study found extremely high concentrations of the toxin known as BMAA in lobsters recovered from the affected area, and given that the lobster trade is pretty much crucial to the region's economy, this could indicate some kind of financially motivated cover-up. As previously stated, federal scientists have issued requests to test the brain tissue of 8 people who have died as a result of the mysterious infection, but provincial officials have refused permission for such studies time and time again. This has the families of the victims all asking the same question: what possible reason might they have to reject such a helpful and harmless request? Not only that, but the provincial government has since sought to distance themselves from Dr. Alir Marrero, the neurologist who identified the infection. New Brunswick Health Minister told a press conference that the situation had escalated, often without oversight, but completely omitted the fact that Dr. Marrero had worked closely with federal scientists when first identifying the cluster. For the most part, experts can only agree on one thing: that due to the volume, age range, and locations of those suffering suggests a much more thorough investigation is required. These kinds of things are rarely just a random collection of sporadically occurring cases that have been artificially lumped together by an over-enthusiastic neurologist, said one scientist. So, for me personally, that excuse just doesn't wash. A committee of neurologists from across the province then headed up a second investigation, but it seemed they neglected to include Dr. Marrero, even though all 48 patients included in the review were treated by him. They really seem to be discrediting him without using his name, said Steve Ellis. Of all people, he has been the one that has been the most communicative during these last few months. His work ethic and his professionalism and empathy are just top-notch, so his exclusion is just unacceptable. Steve added that if it weren't for the leak of the CJD memo last year, the public would still be in the dark. It makes me sick to think that they're trying to set this up to be nothing, he said. And you know what? At the end of the day, if it is nothing, then we still have to figure out how to help people because they're still suffering. Some have attempted to link the phenomenon to the spread of what is known as chronic wasting disease. If you've seen or heard anything about Canadian zombie deer over the past few years, this is the affliction you've been hearing about. It's been tearing its way through the elk and deer populations of 2 Canadian provinces and 24 U.S. states, with some agencies saying there's a significant chance of the disease jumping to humans. On its website, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency reported 5 confirmed infections of wildlife in Saskatchewan and Alberta between January and December of 2018. The CFIA also noted another case of CWD in Quebec from September of that year. The disease belongs to a family of diseases called prion diseases, which included the human form of mad cow disease. It eats holes in the animal's brains, and no cures have been found for it so far. Symptoms of chronic wasting disease for animals include stumbling, lack of coordination, drooling, drooping ears, aggression, listlessness, drastic weight loss, excessive thirst or urination, and a lack of fear or caution. As of yet, there has been no official cases of chronic wasting disease in people, but studies have shown that CWD can pose a risk to non-human primates, such as monkeys, that either eat meat from CWD-infected animals or come in contact with their body fluids. Experimental studies have found that it would be inappropriate to raise the concern that CWD may pose a risk to people and suggest that it's important to prevent human exposures to CWD. At present, CWD occurs in free-range deer and elk at relatively low rates, but according to the Center for Disease Control, in areas where the infection is heavily entrenched, localized infection rates could be higher than 25%, and in the case of one captive herd, the infection rate was a horrifying 75%. As of late 2021, the CDC strongly recommends that hunters test their kills for chronic wasting disease, especially if they're going to eat them. Hunters are also implored to research the areas in which the disease is known to be present and to not shoot or handle meat from deer that either look strange or are acting out of character. If they do happen to see any deer that are staggering, drooling, seem overly aggressive, or are keen to approach them, they are to report the encounter to the Center for Disease Control immediately. Almost 2 years of the most recent pandemic, news of an outbreak of a zombie virus is the last thing anyone wants to hear. But thankfully, the jump from deer and elk to humans has yet to be officially confirmed. Thanks to the relative seclusion of the environment, it's likely that CWD will simply burn its way through the wildlife population, but the pattern of cases around New Brunswick is more than enough to worry the wider scientific community. If a disease like that reached pandemic-level virulence, it could make coronavirus look like the sniffles. And suddenly, the prospect of a zombie apocalypse, albeit not quite the same one Romero had in mind, is suddenly and frighteningly realistic. Not many of us in the modern world will be familiar with the concept of cranial elongation, but body modification is something that's been practiced for thousands of years. And just as the ideas of tattoos or ear piercings are well known and widespread today, ancient people all over the world were just as familiar with cranial elongation. Intentional cranial deformation actually predates written history and was a common practice among a number of widespread and varied cultures all throughout history. The earliest written record of cranial deformation comes from around 400 BCE and is believed to have been written by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, who was immortalized with the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. Hippocrates described a group known by the Greek name macrocephaly, which literally translates to longheads, an African or possibly Indian tribe who were named for their practice of cranial modification. Despite their alarming appearance, elongated skulls have a perfectly rational explanation to them, and despite attempts to do so, there are no grounds to ascribe supernatural explanations to them. Yet in the desert wastelands of southern Peru, there remains one particular set of elongated skulls that stand in stark contrast to the others, and they are known as the Paracas Skulls. Named after the region in which they were found, the Paracas Skulls were discovered in 1928 by Peruvian explorer Julio Tello. Julio stumbled across a huge labyrinthian cemetery containing more than 300 elongated skulls, some of which were thought to be more than 3,000 years old. Most cases of skull elongation are the result of head flattening or head binding during infancy. This is when the skull is deliberately deformed by applying incremental force over a sustained period of time. It sometimes is achieved by binding the head with cloth or, by some more brutal civilizations, using 2 planks of wood to achieve the elongated effect. This is where the Paracas skulls differ, because while cranial deformation may sculpt the shape of the skull, it can't alter the basic characteristics of a regular human skull. Some have suggested that the Paracas skulls are the result of what's known as cradle headboarding, but others say that the position of the foramen magnum is towards the rear of the skull. According to them, normal foramen magnums would be closer to the jawline and would not be affected by the process of elongation. Archaeologists have written papers regarding the position of the foramen magnum in over 1,000 elongated skulls, with one stating that in the Paracas skulls, the position of the foramen magnum is completely different than a normal human being. It is also smaller, which lends itself to our theory that this is not cradle headboarding. This is genetic. On top of that, amateur researchers have described how some of the Paracas skulls have a very pronounced cheekbone, different eye sockets, and no sagittal suture, which is a connective tissue joint between the 2 parietal bones of the skull. In the quest to find the truth behind the skulls, Juan Navarro, owner and director of the Paracas Archaeological Museum, allowed the taking of samples from 3 of the elongated skulls for DNA testing. The samples consisted of hair and bone powder, which were obtained by drilling deep into the foramen magnum to reduce the risk of contamination. The samples were then sent to labs in Canada and the United States for testing, and the geneticists were not told where the samples came from so as not to create any preconceived ideas. When the results came back, they allowed for some fascinating conclusions. One of the skulls was confirmed to be just over 2,000 years old, while the other was found to be only 800 years old, meaning the practice had been sustained in the region for more than 1,000 years. Yet that wasn't the only curious thing about the DNA results. As we previously stated, there isn't anything overtly supernatural about the skulls, and naturally, the DNA came back as human. But 3 hair samples also showed a haplogroup of H2A, which is found most frequently in Eastern Europe and at a low frequency in Western Europe, and the bone powder tested positive for haplogroup T2B, which originates in what is now the region of Iraq and Syria. None of these haplogroups are native to indigenous South Americans, so how did they get there? The primary Native American haplogroups are A, C, and D, which are also found in darkest Siberia. They are believed to have arrived in the Americas by mass migration across the Bering Strait sometime around 35,000 BC. Haplogroup B, on the other hand, is believed to have arrived from across the Pacific around 11,000 BC. If all this holds up, said historian Brian Forrester, the history of prehistoric American migration is far more complex than we originally thought. The results are also consistent with the fact that many of the Paracas skulls still contain traces of red hair, a color that is not natively found in South America, but originates in the Middle East and Europe. As far as we can tell, no expert can explain why some of the skulls still have hair that are red or even blonde, Forrester continued. The idea that this is from a time where bleaching has now been disproven by two separate paleotrichologists. For the ancient Paracas people, at least, they had blonde to reddish hair that is 30% thinner than Native American hair. This is a significant genetic difference. So, if we can trace the DNA in the Paracas skulls all the way back to Eastern Europe, how exactly did they make it all the way to Peru in the 1st century AD? It's not out of the question that some ancient mariner took it upon himself to sail to the ends of the earth. So, what if the Paracas skulls are evidence of just that? What if these brave pioneers somehow made it to Peru, married into the local population, even sired children who would be honored by having their skulls elongated? What if they died believing that, because they were unable to return home, their magnificent feat of ancient seafaring would be lost to history? Never knowing that one day, as a result of decoding the very building blocks were made up of, their incredible journey will graduate from unsolved mystery to revered history. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to always eat the ones you love.